and welcome back to the Goodreads Virtual Book Club. My name is Brianna. The Goodreads Virtual Book Club is a book club we have once a month for adults that is also on Goodreads.com. If you want to check that out, you can go to Goodreads.com, search SSJCPL, and continue to the discussion there. This month, by popular vote, reread Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen Maria Machado. This one was a bit of a heavier read. It's a collection of short stories that basically deals with use, abuse, and different ways people and the characters themselves perceive their bodies and their body autonomy in the world. So we'll kind of go over a little bit of each story and what it's about, and then kind of general afterward thoughts of how you can maybe, or how I at least interpret this tome of short stories. So let's just go ahead and dive right in. All right, so the first story, it really kind of starts off with quite a bang. The first story is called The Husband Stitch, and this one, for me at least, was very reminiscent of like the scary stories you tell in the dark, the one with the woman who has the ribbon on her neck, because this one, every woman in this story has a ribbon, and the main character, who's never named, which I find to be very telling, especially in the story of this main character, she has a ribbon on her neck. And I think that there's a little kind of blurb in the front, a little quote by Jackie Germain that summarizes pretty much every story in this book pretty well. It says, "My body is a haunted house that I am lost in. There are no doors, but there are knives and 100 windows." So The Husband Stitch basically tells the story kind of from birth to death of this unnamed woman and all of the things that she goes through in her life. So we know that she has a ribbon on her neck, and we don't know, but for whatever reason, it has to stay there. It can't come off. And that's true of pretty much all of the other women in the story as well, as wherever their ribbon is in place, that it doesn't come off. One of them has a ribbon on her finger, but you don't meet a lot of other female characters until like the middle of the book. But basically this young girl, she's growing up, she falls in love with this guy. They're very young, they decide to get married, and at first everything is lovely and wonderful, and then it turns sour because the husband becomes focused and intent upon this ribbon and taking this ribbon off or touching this ribbon, even though his wife, the main character, is extremely uncomfortable by him touching the ribbon and by his feeling the need to have it. Basically, this is going to be hard. All of the stories are going to be hard to talk about without spoilers. So before I talk anymore, I'm just going to say spoilers ahead for every story because it's very difficult to talk about them. This one was a relatively short one as well. But basically, she's given up every aspect of her body to her husband, every aspect of her like mental well-being and capacity, and her physical capacity she's already given her husband. She has another son as well, and she gives him just as much of herself as she gives to her husband, and the only thing that she keeps back is this ribbon. And the husband is just never placated by any response that she has. He wants to like subsume her and control her every being, and it gets really heavy and really upsetting, which is most of these stories are pretty heavy and pretty upsetting, until finally she basically, I think she just gives up, and she's like, well, if you really want to find out what's under the ribbon, go ahead. And then he pulls the ribbon, and like the girl in the story from Scary Stories You Tell in the Dark, it's assumed that her head falls off and she dies, because her last vision is of like her head falling off the bed. So if that is pretty much an indicator of the rest of the stories and how this book shapes up. It's definitely not an easy read, and I know the story itself, the husband stitch, refers back to a practice of after a woman gives birth, a doctor will place an extra stitch, which in this story that does happen, and that just showcases, especially in the relationship between the main character and her husband, how much her husband wants to hold sway over both her physical autonomy and her mental autonomy. Because she starts out in the story as being a very independent, vivacious person. She's got her own track in life, and then once she gets married, it kind of her track diverts and just kind of follows whatever her husband's track is. So that's the very bare bones basic of the first story. It's pretty short, but it is fairly shocking to read. The next story is called Inventory, and this one is also a shorter one, and it's about another girl at a party, and she is just kind of having a good time at this party and enjoying herself. I have to remind myself a little bit of what it's about. Some stories definitely take more presence in your mental space than others. That first story will stay up here forever. This one is equally bad in its own way for this poor woman, but it's basically all of this woman's relationships. She's stuck in prophetically, since this book was published in 2017, prophetically a post-apocalyptic world where some type of disease kind of has wiped out a whole population. But before that epidemic in this novel happened, it just kind of goes over all of her different relationships with both men and with women, and there's a definite difference between her relationships and how they go between her relationships with men and her relationships with women. Her romantic relationships with men are very similar to the first story, where these guys just kind of want to just like consume her and be fully in charge of her, and not, think of her as like a life partner, where her romantic partners with women are much more balanced and even, and not all of them, but especially the last one that she has. And then it kind of goes into this epidemic where we're in this post-apocalyptic landscape, and the main character, who's also not named, is moving from place to place to place and state to state to state, trying to get away from this sickness that is consuming everybody else. And she ends up in this place, I think in Maine is where she ends up, and she has a really lovely relationship with an older woman, a romantic relationship where they kind of like are helping people. They take in kind of like pseudo parents in this weird post-apocalyptic landscape, where they're taking in other travelers and other people who have no place to go, or maybe have lost all of their families. And sadly, the older woman romantic partner passes away from the epidemic, and it's kind of left up to interpretation what happens to the main character, kind of assuming that she will also pass away from the sickness, but you don't know exactly. The third story is called Mothers, and this one is very odd. A lot of these stories, like I have to say, they make you think so much, because there's so much between the lines that you have to interpret, and everybody's interpretation is I'm bound to be a little bit different, which is endlessly entertaining. To talk to other people and see how they felt and what they felt about it. But this one is called Mothers, and another unnamed main character You don't know if she has a baby or doesn't have a baby, but she has this very tumultuous relationship with a woman she calls Bad. And Bad shows up and like dumps this baby on her doorstep and is telling her like, you're the mother, she's yours. So you can perhaps assume that she's in a severe post-delivery depression, perhaps, like a almost like a post-delivery psychosis, because she doesn't really know where she doesn't have a great memory for current events, but her past, like her relationship and how she got to know Bad and everything is very vivid still in her mind, but she doesn't really know or seemingly understand what's happening in her present. Like she doesn't know who this baby is. She doesn't really know why she has to care for it. Bad leaves all of a sudden, but Bad keeps telling her that there's this baby and this baby is yours. And she just doesn't quite know what to do with that or what to think about that. And she has all of these, maybe they're dreams, maybe they're kind of recollections of the past that had happened, that, or the recent past that she has just kind of blocked from her memory, where she ends up going into kind of like where she grew up, into the house where she grew up, taking care of 2 kids now, and just like an imagining of this whole life, which perhaps is a true imagining. Maybe, you know, who knows? It's really hard to say what is real and what is not. It's a very unreliable narrator, so you can't necessarily believe everything she says or anything you hear from anybody else in the story. But she has this whole very vivid, she calls a dream of living in this, in her childhood home, where like all of the rooms, all of the bedrooms, like how it's decorated, and all of this stuff. And there's these 2 kids in there that she's trying to take care of. They don't have a lot of money seemingly, but she's doing her best. And it ends with which again, perhaps, and it's hard to say because perhaps this did in fact happen and it's in the recent past and Bad, as we say, because a man and a woman show up at the door and are basically like, why are you here? These are our kids. Get out. We're going to call the police. And she's just here. So it's perhaps an interpretation could be that this did happen to her in her recent past, that perhaps these are her kids and Bad has taken them and moved on and had a different life, and she's just an outsider looking in, but subconsciously knows that this perhaps is supposed to be, or the life that she wanted. And she's constantly trying to say, you know, trying to be the best mother she can be, but feeling that she's continually a bad mother. And it's like there's a very interesting flood in this house where, like, the last line is, we've been bad mothers and have not taught you how to swim. So it could also, another interpretation could be that this is her imaginings of the future. She has 1 baby, she just had this said baby, and she's feeling very overwhelmed about not knowing how to be a mother, because we do get those glimpses into her past where her mother wasn't necessarily the most hands-on mother, shall we say, and she feels like she just doesn't know how to be a mother to this new child. She's feeling very overwhelmed, and the flood is these feelings of being so overwhelmed that she doesn't know how to move on. That's kind of my interpretation, but again, I would love to hear your thoughts either below in the comments or on Goodreads.com, search SSJCPL. Comment your favorite story, your least favorite story, or your own interpretation. I'd love to talk about it because this book has so much to talk about. The next one is the by far the longest story in the short story collection. It's called Especially Heinous, 272 views of Law & Order SVU. I think one of the most interesting things about this is they go through like 9 or 10 seasons of Law & Order SVU, and it's definitely not the Law & Order SVU we know from the show, but all of the episode titles are the same, and they're the actual episode titles of the show in Law & Order SVU. So you start in season 1, you start with Stabler and Benson, and they're, solving crime and doing their thing. And then this is kind of where this short story collection takes a sharp turn, and you have these two parallel characters called Henson and Abler that are Stabler and Benson, but like better or more perfect, have like a perfect case solve record, and you don't know how these two parallel storylines are going to intersect. Benson starts to see all of these missing and murdered girls and young children, and they all have bells for eyes. I interpret it as the bells for eyes being like a reminder, like an actual noise reminder that's like, hey, we're still here. They're gonna ring their bells to say like, hey, we're here, we want help, we need your help. And she like gets so consumed by this, seeing all of these missing and murdered women and children, which, as you know on the show, that is what the show is about, Special Victims Unit. And then their parallel versions are seemingly in the same dimension. So Benson and Stabler, Henson and Abler are seemingly in the same dimension as each other, because their paths do eventually cross, but at least at first their paths cross through other people. So people will be confused as to who's what. And like they think that they know the person because they know their parallel selves and not the real. And then there's the question of which one is the real Stabler and Benson, Henson and Abler. Which one is more real, shall we say? Which one is more real, which I think could be interpreted as like an internal conflict you have between not necessarily your good and your bad self, but like your conscious and your subconscious, like just a conflict within your own being where you feel these two very distinct, separate emotions, and they can't really intersect and to become one whole person. So you literally in this book have two distinct selves who are acting and doing similar things, but making very different choices, kind of like that path not taken. Like if you instead of turning left, if you had gone right, what would that parallel self do? That's very reminiscent in this story. And basically the paths do eventually cross, and to explosive results. But this one is very, very long. You can kind of see each episode here has just like a little paragraph or two about a reimagining of this alternate time and space version of Law & Order SVU and what that would look like, and how all of these horrific events can affect and kind of tear down somebody's psyche. But yeah, that one they're all hard chapters. That one was particularly difficult, because it was really difficult. That is all I will say about that one. The next one is called Real Women Have Bodies. And this one is also very interesting and can be interpreted so many ways. I think the most interesting part is the only named female main character in this whole series of short stories is Benson and Henson. Nobody else has a name. Which could be, you can put yourself in the story, you can imagine or interpret it any way you will, because there's no definite one thing to assign to any story. But this one, Real Women Have Bodies, our main character works in like a mall, and kind of like a Forever 21 is how I envisioned it. But she's working in a mall with clothing, and again, this like post-apocalyptic narrative where there's not, like, just the world is crumbling around them. It's really difficult to get any jobs. So she has, which again, it's not that dissimilar to a lot of struggles that people are actually going through right now, is she has an advanced degree but can't get a job in that degree, so is working anywhere that she possibly can just to provide for herself. And so she's in this store, just kind of like, she really likes her job. She takes it very seriously, which a lot of other people don't. So she does want to do a good job. And she meets this other character who supplies the clothing for this store. So an interesting thing that I do want to note is there is a disease in this story that kind of also gives it a post-apocalyptic edge, where all the women and young girls who get this disease basically slowly disappear. Like physically, they disappear. They turn invisible. You can't see them anymore. They're like ghosts. Which, well, I'll get to my interpretation in a minute. We'll keep going. But basically, so all of the women become ghosts. So she meets this other young lady. They have a romantic relationship. This other young lady and her mother make sew a lot of the clothes that this clothing store sells. So the main character quits her job and moves in with the young lady who she's fallen in love with and her mother. And they live/run a hotel while also making dresses on the side. And she finds out a big secret about these dresses that she's been selling in this department store, and kind of why she's always felt that there's something a little bit different about these dresses is the women that have disappeared and become ghosts their incorporeal bodies go back into these dresses. So these dresses aren't just clothing or fashion, they're actual people. And I think, my interpretation could be that because the fashion world, especially high fashion, is so specific in terms of body type and physical appearance, it's like you have to fit yourself into the clothes. The clothes don't have to fit you or your body type or your person. You have to fit into the clothes. So you have to make yourself almost disappear in order to fit into these clothes that are deemed fashionable by the media. That was my interpretation. But again, it's up to interpretation. I have to say, none of these stories are happy. None of them have a good ending. This one doesn't as well. Basically, the young woman that the main character falls in love with catches this disease that's affecting all of these women and girls and disappears or is at least starting on her way to disappearing at the end of the book, or this story. And the next story is called 8 Bites. Somewhat in a similar vein to the feeling the need to fit the society's beauty mold. This one is also, the main character is wanting to go through gastric bypass surgery. Her sisters have gone through it before. And her mother, it's called 8 Bites because her mother always used to tell them that if you take 8 bites of any food, and once you have your 8th bite, you're good. You don't need any more. And she just has never really felt comfortable in her body. She's always felt that it's taken up too much room. And so she wants to undergo this surgery in order to be happier with her body and basically meet familial and society expectations and standards of what her body should look like. And she has a daughter in the story, and her daughter is completely disagrees with her mother's viewpoint of her body. And there was one really sad scene where they're on the phone And the daughter basically asks the mom, like, do you not love me then? Because my body looks like your body. Do you not love my body? Do you not think I'm beautiful? And the mother just hangs up on her because she can't fathom a response to that question. She does undergo the gastric bypass surgery. And in this story, when you undergo it, it's like your past self, the self that you got rid of during your gastric bypass and the recovery time after, becomes its own corporal thing that still takes care of you, but she hates it. Like, she hates this past version of herself so much. There's another scene where she basically beats up this past version of herself because she can't even stand to look at it. And it lives in her house, and it's like still taking care of her. But they're two distinct beings now instead of one, because she can never be happy with that past self because that past self didn't fit those familial and societal roles of what a woman's body should look like. And the end of this story ends where basically the mother passes away, and before she passes away, she whispers to this corporal being of her old self, "I'm sorry," I will whisper into her as she walks me toward the front door. "I'm sorry," I will repeat, "I didn't know." And basically she just didn't know how to handle the body that she was given, or the body that she chose. That one, I think, is one of my favorite stories in this story collection. It was just very powerful. The next story is called The Resident, and this one, once again, an unnamed main character. She is a writer, and she is going to a artist colony to write her book that's kind of like a parallel of her own life, but fictionalized. And where the artist colony is at a camp where her Girl Scout troop used to go. This one is very to me at least, how the trope of the crazy woman in the attic, like from Jane Eyre, where the wife was in there, just the trope of the crazy woman in the attic, and what happens with the crazy woman in the attic, and is she really crazy, or is that something that other people perceive? And what is exactly crazy? What's the definition of crazy? So yeah, basically she's going to this artist colony with all these other artists, and as she is there longer and longer, her behavior becomes more erratic. And her interpretation of that is that these other people are misinterpreting her thoughts or putting words in her mouth, making her feel like she's crazy, when in reality they themselves are the crazy ones. They're the ones doing all of this weird stuff that the main character doesn't understand. And she's eventually decides to leave this artist colony and go back to her wife, who she talks about all through the story, but you never hear from her wife. You only hear what the main character thinks of her wife and what she writes to her. You never hear back. And so she decides she has to leave this artist colony. Is it perhaps this environment is what's making her this crazy woman in the attic? And so she leaves. She gets back to the home that she shares with her wife, and when she gets there, basically none of that is true. It's not her home. And she thinks for a second that perhaps she's Rip Van Winkled herself. In this artist colony, perhaps she fell asleep and she woke up and it's 1,000 years later and nothing is the same. Because the person she knows as her wife is married to somebody else with a completely different life than what she had thought of. And I thought it was really interesting because this one ends, since the main character is a writer, this one ends with, it's like, I know what you're thinking, reader. So the main character addresses us personally. You're thinking, does this woman have the temperament to come to our residency? So basically the ending is this is her entry letter to this artist colony or another artist colony. So you don't know, like, is this her book? Is this her book of fictionalized events of her own life, or is this something completely different? You don't know. And then I believe this is the last one. Yeah, this is the last story. The last story is called Difficult at Parties. Surprise, surprise, another unnamed female narrator. And this one is about another young woman and her partner. And this young woman seemingly is very sick with some unknown illness. We don't know. I have my own thoughts about it, but I don't know. And this man is taking care, like her partner is taking care of her. And basically it's a difficult one because there's a lot of scenes where they get these adult DVDs and she's watching these adult DVDs, but also hearing in her mind, or perhaps not, voices of all of the women in these adult DVDs saying other things. So like one interpretation I had could be that perhaps this woman, because she talks about a baby, perhaps she had a miscarriage and is like trying to reconnect with her body in a sense. Could also be perhaps she works in the adult film industry and maybe against her will and is desperate for somebody to hear her voice the way she can hear these other women's voices. It's hard to say. All of these stories, again, are so up to interpretation. Anybody's interpretation could be very different than what I interpreted. And I would love to know what your thoughts are, because I could talk about all of these stories, I feel like, for years and maybe not come to any firm conclusions about what they were. But so the synopsis of this whole book, which I feel like really encapsulate what it's about, was startling narratives that map the realities of women's lives and the violence visited upon their bodies. And this is very true, whether it be physical violence or psychological violence of a different sort. That's very, very true. It's hard for me to rate this book. I can't say I enjoyed it just because the subject matter was so intense and it was so hard to read, but I also couldn't put it down. And again, like I said, I could talk about this for years to come. So I don't know if I liked it or I didn't like it. And that's the hard part. Let me know if you liked it or didn't like it, and then maybe I'll be able to come up with a better consensus. But so that is what we read for this month. It's called Her Body and Other Parties. Next month, we're doing it a little bit lighter, and we're going to read a kid's book called Ghost Squad. So I hope you join me then. All right, thank you for watching.